to the present, like continuing this kind of trajectory forward. Creative AI might kind of like transform itself and also reclaim something of what has perhaps been kind of lost from what was previously there. So this is basically the idea. Algorithms should be repurposed for modernism. Modernism is something I'm going to hope that can define for you as like a concrete and like an abstract version. The concrete version was an art movement from the late 19th century. Some people say it kind of stopped in the 1980s. Some people say it continues today. But I'm going to talk particularly about the way in which algorithms could be used for a kind of modernist project. It doesn't necessarily mean producing modernist artworks, but a more kind of general project of producing the new. And a lot of what happens in kind of creative AI is that you have some sort of sample set and you try and produce something that is like quite similar to your sample set, of course. So, and then we're kind of producing like a huge amount more content, but it's not entirely clear in what ways that constructs like a kind of a new form of signification or a new form of experience or a new form of art. But of course those things happen. They kind of often happen as artifacts of the process. So there are kind of three domains. The title is Three Images of the New. I'm going to talk about philosophy, social science, and practice design. I'm going to skip over philosophy and social science very quickly, but going to suggest some ideas about them, and talk mostly about practice design, just the idea that behavior is a kind of like a structure that can be designed itself using creative AI tools. So serialism is the art movement I'm going to be talking about. It's an art movement that began slightly before the Second World War, and then kind of came into its heyday in the 1950s, 1960s. And what it basically is an attempt to parametricize music. So you start with kind of musical material, and what you have to do is you have to like pick what the next note in your piece is going to be. And so what you do is you generate very simple sets, and you generate kind of set transformations. So they have kind of these internally consistent properties. The first three notes relate to each other in the same way, with the next three notes, and the next three notes, and the next three notes, and you can make kind of very elegant structures, basically with 12 notes. And then they kind of stop using just pitch classes, and start using rhythms as well. So they think about like there are kind of 12 different durations, and they kind of use those as kind of parameters. And so you can see that the music eventually starts kind of writing itself. Sandra did a really excellent presentation of some WaveNet stuff last month about kind of sample-to-sample generation of sound. And what's interesting there is the idea of a parameter has become incredibly general, incredibly abstract. So what we're just generating is another number in a series, basically, and that happens to correspond to a kind of a sound wave, or you're generating a sound wave. But you could also take this series of numbers and you could put them into images, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I think has kind of changed there is there's a kind of domain specificity to the way that serialism works. There's a kind of domain specificity. There are particular dimensions of music. There is sound, there is pitch, there is location around the room, there is how loud you're playing something, there's what instrument you're playing it on, all these kind of things. And in the kind of contemporary creative AI space, quite a lot of this specificity is lost. That's exhilarating, but I want to kind of suggest that there's like another way of doing this. So Yannis Xenakis was a composer after the Second World War. He was actually injured in the Second World War in the resistance in Athens. His face was kind of like scarred by a grenade that was thrown by a Nazi soldier, obviously at him. And more famously, he was a composer and an architect. So this is one of his buildings on the left. It's the Phillips Pavilion. It's based on a sketch by Le Corbusier in 1958. And as you can see, it has this kind of incredibly dramatic curve. Right? It's like it's a function. You could define that curve not in a kind of general sense, but as an actual mathematical function. And so he tried basically in his career to import mathematical structures that he knew about into both buildings and into music. So he wrote this thing called Formalized Music, which maybe you can't see. The subtitle is Thought and Mathematics in Composition. So this idea of trying to import something that is kind of alien, namely the structure of mathematics in quite a complicated way, into the structure of music, which is of course an idea that dates to antiquity. People were doing that, or kind of like relating the ideas of music and maths all the way back in ancient Greece. But the point is here that neither field is reduced to the other. There's a constant conflict between the ways in which maths and music are kind of imported. And so I was going to play you a musical example. We haven't got any sounds, unfortunately. So you're going to have to look at this diagram instead. So what it says here, this is a section of a piece called Pitha Practa from 1953. This is a kind of a section about 30 seconds in length. And what you're seeing on here is time. And what you're seeing here is pitch content. The y-axis is pitch content. And so what this actually is a description of Brownian motion. So the way he derives pitches is from the velocities of particles. So the higher the velocity of the particle, the higher up the space it goes. Now, what's happened here is there's been a kind of several media transitions. So we can take information from one space, put it into another one, and put it into another one, and put it into another one. And so there's this kind of media specificity, there's a domain specificity that is being preserved and to some extent accentuated. So Brownian motion, of course, operates in four-dimensional space. It's three-dimensional space and one dimension of time. So there are four dimensions of Brownian motion. In this, there are only two dimensions. And so it's kind of a projection. But there's also another transition which has happened here. So there's actual fluids, right? Actual gas. And then there's the abstraction of Brownian motion, and then there's kind of a reconcretization that goes into the music. And each time there are multiple points at which transformation occurs. Lots of music is formed from the collision of different systems. You can think about techno as the collision of different systems. You can think about absolutely anything in this kind of way. But what is kind of unique here is there is an attempt to really kind of force something on something else. There's an abstract image, an abstract structure, it gets forced onto the kind of concrete stuff of the music itself. Does everyone kind of get where I'm going with this? Yeah? More or less okay. So there are two aspects here, right? There's the abstraction or parametrization of things in the world, and there's a media specificity, and these two things are constantly in tension. These things are constantly in tension in modernist artworks. So I'm going to define modernism as the interdisciplinary integration of logic and media combined with wild parametric experimentation. Probably not going to agree with that definition. Very, very disputed term, modernism. This is definitely not what most people think it is. So what does this mean? Interdisciplinary integration, we've seen that in terms of, sort of abstract structure. It could be mathematically defined, it could be non-mathematically defined, and then it get integrated into a particular medium. And this is combined with wild parametric experimentation. Now, wild and parametric are not really terms that normally go together. What do I mean by wild parametric experimentation? I mean that once you have a codified structure of how something works, then it's much easier to experiment with it. If you've ever done any music improvisation, you know that what ultimately comes out after you've played 50 hours is just the most basic stuff you know. And you kind of just return and return and return and return. But the ability to construct a codified system of how something is working, of course, allows you to experiment with it in a much more explicit way. And I would suggest a much more kind of robust way. So the suggestion about the kind of what the image of the new in philosophy would be, about importing some of these ideas from machine learning into philosophy, would be you would essentially think of critique and the process of critique as the making visible of hyperparameters. So by acting in a system, the system of being alive, you kind of come, after some degree of experimentation, to understand the way in which the system itself is defined. And this is kind of the process of critique. You can think about kind of social criticism that attempts to view society as a set of kind of constraints, as operating in a way that tries to come up against the limits of that system, and in doing so, explore what are the kind of hyperparameters the system as a whole. There's a kind of counter-argument to this, but skip over this. The idea of thrownness in philosophy comes from the idea that you're kind of thrown into the world without having any way of navigating yourself. I could kind of suggest here that there's a similarity with the way that search spaces work, and the way that kind of any individual node in a search space, and they all have to kind of coordinate to find the maximum of some given variable in the search space. This is kind of like the process of rationalization, but this is far too esoteric. And also maybe kind of unfleshed out. So Luba mentioned earlier that I was a composer before, and the last project I was doing was writing an opera. And that opera was about a woman who decided to kind of commit her life exclusively to the control of algorithms, and what that would do. And I decided I wasn't really interested in writing the music, I was just interested in actually doing that in my own life. And so what I'm going to describe to you is some ways this could happen as a kind of project, and also some ways that I've already tried to do it, although I should clarify that I'm definitely not technically capable of doing it, so this is also kind of a sales pitch to those of you who are. So there's an abstracted logic, and then there's a medium. And in serialism we had sets, and set theory, and music. And my suggestion is that both of these processes are abstracted, both of these processes are generalized in the history of modernism. Until from sets, as a particular instantiation of a formal logic, we have the process of proceduralization in the form of the algorithm itself. And so the logic is proceduralization. That's quite a difficult idea. So not only is the kind of thing that you're addressing becoming more abstract, but the process of abstraction itself is being applied to the kind of logic. There's the media, which is music, and I'm suggesting that there is the entire field of human behaviour. So there are two modes of abstraction here. There's abstraction from things to logics, but the process of abstraction itself takes on an abstract character. Come and find me in the pub afterwards. Well, this will be easier. And so what this kind of relates to is the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is the kind of German word. It means like total artwork, and that's what opera was for a very long time. It was an attempt to synthesize all the various artworks. So you can question, like, why did this project fail? Well, it failed because media are resistant to their integration, but also it failed because of budget cuts. There's just like, the First World War happens, you don't have enough money to pay 120 people to sit in an orchestra anymore because you've got to fund the war effort. And modernism kind of begins in part, like, interestingly, hip-hop does, because no one has any more money. So practice design. So we're trying to import a kind of abstractive logic into the structure of human behaviour in order to generate novelty. So how does social control function? So the question is really like, how is this media, the structure of human behaviour as it currently stands, how is it formed? Why do we do the things we do? What are the structuring elements of the things that we do? And that's what I mean by a social control. So it functions through protocols, or they're often known as apparatuses in different parts of the literature. Protocols is Alexander Galloway's term, and apparatus is a term from Foucault, but it's used in Agamben as well to mean a really kind of disparate collection of things that structure behaviour. So it's a kind of set of rules that governs behaviour in a domain. And how can we see them? So the question is, how do we make these things visible so that the codification of a particular set of structure can happen? So we can see what it is we are doing when we are acting in the world. It's by attempting to act differently, using wild parametric experimentation. So the idea here is that you would quantify all your behaviour. This kind of common practice in the quantified self movement. You would quantify all your behaviour. You construct an auto-encoded description of that behaviour, and then you would try and modulate parameters in that autoencoder in order to generate and understand ways, and then you would try and act as if that autoencoder was your behaviour. So you would use it to generate instructions for yourself in the future. Okay. And then you would inevitably experience resistance. Right? You'd inevitably experience resistance from yourself as a kind of a body, but you would experience social resistance as well. So critical practice design is the question of asking how can making explicit of practices, making explicit of the way in which we do things, leads to the further design of more and more like kind of interesting practices for ourselves. So this requires mass or bespoke data collection and a description of what our protocols are. So already in your life, you will kind of notice there are all kinds of things around you. The most obvious one of which is that you have to go to work. It kind of attempts to codify your human behaviour in such a way that value can be abstracted from it. Right? That's the point of going to work, is that someone can abstract profit from it. So the quantified self movement attempts to quantify behaviour and describe behaviour in order to generate its own kind of like ends. People are interested in thinking about what they're doing in their life in order to improve some aspect of it. Businesses are interested in thinking about what it is you're doing in your life in order to extract profit from it. My suggestion is that the project of modernism is interested in thinking about what it is you're doing in order to elaborate a kind of media specificity, the specific logic of the interaction between humans and outcomes. So here are some possible relations that you could have between your model and any future activity. So the kind of standard one is at the top. Do activities such that over time some kind of parameter is optimized, right? You might have like a happiness quota and you like construct a set of activities such that your happiness goes up. But there are actually loads of other ways you could relate to it. So you could say that you could do activities such that they can't appear in the data collection system. That's a really, really common practice people do all the time. People kind of leave Facebook. People can leave and stop having data collected about them all the time. Very, very common. I suggest it's not the most interesting way forward, and I don't think it's one that anyone here is going to subscribe to. So do activities such that the least likely thing to happen in any given situation happens. So the idea is that in any given context, you have a list of things that are most likely to happen. You have a list of things that are most likely to follow other things, as they would in like a Markov chain or in a neural net. And what you do is instead of trying to find the thing that is most likely, you try and find the thing that is at the bottom of that list. Right? What is least likely to happen now? and you start acting in such a way that you invert the social structure. So do activities such that the data collection can most clearly understand what you are doing. So you could say that there is a kind of data collection logic here, there's a kind of data collection material, and you are trying to perform to it. You're trying to make sure that absolutely everything that you do is visible to this. You could do activities such that the data set of activities over time that the algorithm is capable of understanding as discrete increases. That's kind of how you would interact with a child. Right? You have the child doesn't know anything, or knows very few things, and you kind of gradually teach it new things and new things and new things and new things. And so you act in such a way as to separate out, over time, gently, the activities that you're doing. In such a way that the sensitivity of your algorithm and its adequacy as a model of your life increases. You could do activities that has some kind of structure visible in the activities you were doing before becomes invisible. So you have like some list of parameters. So they're all at like some value after the codification of your behavior. And then you set one of them to 0. And you try and live as if that parameter simply wasn't existing. So whatever that structure is in your life, which would not be a kind of structure probably that you're able to apprehend. You wouldn't be able to say, it's my boss, it's my biological needs. But it would be some other kind of mathematically defined structure. You could say that you could redesign your practices such that that structure disappears. Okay, so that's, you can read the other ones. So the last one was what I was suggesting there. You could do activities according to the model, except experiment with some of the parameters. This is the wild parametric experimentation that I was talking about. So the question is, how does this relate to our human needs and being human? So the question is, like, how can we use algorithms to push beyond what we can already do? That was kind of suggested that we would kind of update ourselves by having, like, kind of plugging ourselves in to various practices, plugging ourselves into, like, being able to write music, plugging ourselves into this. But this isn't really what I'm kind of aiming for. What I'm aiming for is that you would do activities in such a way that doesn't relate to a kind of updating of yourself, but that relates to a kind of community between you and the algorithm. So the axiom of how you relate to technologies, which is that technologies are the design of machines for rational ends. You have something you want to do, you design a machine, that machine does the thing, is suspended. Right? It's no longer the principle upon which we are functioning. Because there is an internal logic to the way the machine works that is counter to and oppositional to the way that we would choose to live our lives. So the question is, what are the domains of human action and the human medium? What are the dimensions, of the human action? And what is the human medium? These are things for like a long-term experimentation. You would need mass and bespoke data collection to answer effectively what the dimensions are. And the human medium is, again, a much more complicated question about people and society more generally. So these are the early experiments I've already done in this regard. The first one was the design of what I call decapitation. Basically, I recorded everything I did in an app for about 3 months. And then I generated a model of what that would be. And then it was kind of a Markov chain-based model, so it would go back to the last 4 activities, or 3 activities it was, that I had done, and it would predict the next likely activity, and then simply there was an inversion of that. So it would simply tell me to do the least likely thing had I been in a kind of normal situation. And so what happens to this is that the kind of day-to-day movement of your life falls apart, right? You just can't operate like that, because I almost never go from activity A to activity K. I go A, B, C, A, B, A, C, K, like that. But I kind of like leap around. And so what happens is you experience the kind of syntax of your day, you experience the kind of successional logic of your day, but only in the moment it's kind of breaking down. Proclivities is a kind of more abstract project. It's an attempt to redesign some of your proclivities. One example you could think of is what's called the exploration proclivity. The idea is that you have like some resources, and the question is like, exploration is how much you want to explore new resources. Exploitation is how much you engage with the resources you already have. And you can modulate this, and this is a kind of a way of like tuning a certain parameter in your life. The navigation I'm not going to go into, but it's like a more abstract project again. The idea is there's an experimentation with the rules of navigation, so how one navigates systems. So this is the overall project. The explicitation of the parameters, explicitation just means making explicit. Explicitation of parameters of the system of human behaviours should be used to experiment with system states beyond the usual bounds of its functioning, to design new protocols for action which are neither humanist in intention nor expect reintegration into the social totality. So hopefully that was partially clear. Does anyone have any questions?